Okay, friends, the time has come to return to the Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV, Episode 7, A Realm Awoken.
It's clear A Realm Reborn is a much improved game, but it's only now that we've completed the story and participated in the endgame that we realize the full extent of the improvement. There's still minor issues here and there, and the endgame content is brutal with its own unique set of problems, but overall, this is a very good MMO that's done its homework. It's a shame Square Enix had to go through such a painful and lengthy process to get here, but A Realm Reborn was worth the wait.
Yeah, boy! So worth the wait, baby! A little bit of a new intro. Damn. So good, so powerful.
After the troubled, yet successful relaunch of Final Fantasy XIV in the shape of A Realm Reborn, players once again started to settle in the new old world of Eorzea. One of Final Fantasy XIV A Realm Reborn's most prominent launch features was the introduction of the male Mikote and the female Rogadin, which were absent from the game's original release, much like how Mithra were female and Galka were male only in Final Fantasy XI. The character creator got a facelift, however, it would still retain its lists of presets over sliders, to many players' dismay. Final Fantasy XIV would continue to receive universal praise from most major video game critics for weeks after release, but this would not last if the dev team didn't work hard, pushing out updates frequently. You see, A Realm Reborn was hastily knocked together in less than 2 years. An MMO of this scale would normally require twice that time, if not more, to be fully functional.
Yeah.
A Realm Reborn is not only impressive for being a remake of a Final Fantasy MMO, but it's impressive for being a fully functional AAA MMO that was developed and released after only 2 years.
Which is wild.
But once you start to look deeper,
years
the
is so
cracks
short.
start to show. To save time on development cost and time, a lot of assets, code, and data from 1.0 was used in the creation of A Realm Reborn. This would give the newly released game a technical debt from day one. Technical debt, or code debt, is a concept in software development that can be compared to monetary debt. You take up a loan, so you can, say, get a really fancy looking car. Now you have a shiny car, but you still don't actually have the money to pay it off, so interest starts accumulating. In Final Fantasy XIV's case, the team reused assets from 1.0 and avoided adding certain basic features to the game to cut both cost and time. This would mean the dev team would have to rework and add these basic features over time while still providing other new content to the game. As time progresses, more features will become standard for MMOs, adding to the game's technical debt. Failing to pay off their technical debt or ignoring it altogether would eventually lead to the game appearing aged and restrictive compared to competing MMO titles. The trick was to hide it and try to resolve the debt silently over time. The game's cutscenes, which used to be cutting-edge motion capture in 1.0, with lip-syncing occurring in certain instances, was replaced with more cost-effective in-game emotes and non-synchronous lip movements. This was most likely done to lower the time and cost of having to sync the lips to the different languages the game shipped with, and of course the cost of motion capture.
Which is completely understandable, but I remember in earlier episodes in this series just being completely blown away at how good the 1.0 cutscenes look. Like, they are better than some modern day releases in terms of animation and lip syncing. Dragon Age Velga.
Some elements still used
Unbelievable.
motion capture, but for the most part, A Realm Reborn's cutscenes were standardized without damaging the game's overall quality. An inevitable issue that would face the game at launch was a direct result of A Realm Reborn's past: the game's economy. Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 had numerous extremely wealthy players who were now entering A Realm Reborn's brand new economy. Servers that survived the calamity was branded legacy servers, and these were expected to have a particularly rocky start. To combat the imminent inflation of the game's currency, all 1.0 players had their money slashed by removing one digit off the end. This also applied to the prices in A Realm Reborn. A potion which used to cost 1,000 gil in 1.0 would only cost 100 in A Realm Reborn. In addition to this, vendor items would have prices set at a slightly higher cost than they would in 1.0 in an attempt to slowly remove gil from circulation. This would only be one of many future attempts at regulating the gil. Link shells, 1.0's guild-like system similar to Final Fantasy XIV's link shells, where players could talk to each other in private chat rooms, survived the transition and would see very little change from its 1.0 version. One major change though was the removal of the link shell crest and the introduction of free companies. Free companies would become the game's guild system, similar to link shells, but with added bonuses such as free company actions, which could grant members unique perks such as increased EXP gain or reduced teleportation costs, with housing planned to accommodate the companies in the future. Link shells transitioned from being guilds to chat channels.
That WoW has
one of 1.0's most important and prominent community features was its forum, which was used to gather feedback from players for future development of the game. Since 1.0's community had been falling apart in the mid-2011s, it had garnered a rather loyal set of players that were, let's say, more than critical to the re-release of Final Fantasy XIV. The forums naturally carried over in a more stylized form fitting the rebranding of Final Fantasy XIV. Players who enjoyed what 1.0 had to offer and had an active subscription for 3 months during the Legacy campaign in 2012 would have their accounts marked as Legacy accounts, which would award the players with a cheaper monthly subscription and the Legacy Chocobo. A chocobo with distinct features, the color being darker in tone and having black end feathers. The barding is unique in design and the beak is tattooed with the Legacy mark.
Nice.
Something that would also be visible on their character's back, the Mark of the 12. And if the character had completed the 1.0 Dalamud questline Living on a Prayer, they would also enjoy a modified storyline to make the transition feel more seamless. The starting cutscene literally continues where 1.0's dramatic ending left off, with the adventurer being teleported away by Louis Soir 5 years into the future.
Oh, cool.
The changes went fairly deep, with certain cutscenes' tones being completely different to certain cutscenes, like the ending to A Realm Reborn's dramatic Praetorium sequence, having an additional scene as a final reward and thank you to the 1.0 players who struggled through and supported the failed 1.0 version of the game. The biggest reward for Legacy players, however, was the game's initial raid, the Binding Coil of Bahamut.
Woo!
The raid in many ways continued the Living on a Prayer questline from 1.0 with an exploration of the aftermath of Bahamut's destruction and subsequent disappearance. The raid would be the dev team's first attempt at a large-scale raid experience, and the tiers were split into turns, going from turn 1 through 5. Unfortunately, the dev team didn't quite understand what players expected from a raid and added a turn that had no bosses or loot and required the players to complete a jumping puzzle to reach the exit.
Oh.
Worse, since turns had to be completed in order, this turn had to be cleared every week by statics to proceed to turn 4 and 5.
No.
It was bad.
That is a terrible
Players were
idea.
left puzzled as to why this was even in the Coil series at all. Some believing it was an unfinished turn shoved into release without the bosses and loot in them. But shortly after these questions hit the official forums, community rep Bayonne ensured all players that this turn was, in fact, how it was designed from the start. Immediate player backlash ensued. How could this turn even be considered as part of the game's highest difficulty content? Raid teams were furious. It was a waste of time and offered no reward. The end of the Binding Coil of Bahamut, turn 5 to be exact, would quickly make up for turn 3's horrible design. But the queen of the first coil was not without faults. Her fight was riddled with bugs that would occur under certain conditions, and maintenances were conducted several times, rendering turn 5 completely inaccessible for hours
Twister,
at a time
baby!
during the raid's first weeks.
Twist and shout.
The most pressing issues Twintania suffered from were related to the additional enemies that would appear during a specific point in the encounter. These would, if killed immediately after spawning, or stunned prior to being killed, remain alive with 0 HP, ultimately killing the party. There was one rumor that has persisted long after the Binding Coil had concluded, claiming that the Twisters were flat out broken in A Realm Reborn.
They still are.
Though the Twisters were nerfed, the claim that they were broken is incorrect. Twister was an attack cast by Twintania during the latter half of the fight. It would have an incredibly quick cast time and required the raid's immediate and full attention.
Yeah, and has no marker, no indicator, no
shortly
nothing.
after have a small Twister form behind them. If a player made contact with the Twister, it would immediately kill them. The mechanic remained a mystery for weeks and weeks after release, wiping all
I did this
who
a couple months
attempted
ago
to
for the
clear
first time, and I'm still
The
fucking
community
triggered.
was outraged and demanded the fight to be fixed. However, the official response from the dev team was that the Twisters were working as intended, and the claim by the community that the Twisters were entirely random, thus making them impossible to dodge, was wrong. On October the 26th, 2013, 2 months after the raid's release, the Order of the Blue Garter finally cleared Turn 5 before any nerfs befell the Twister mechanic. It turned out that the Twisters could be avoided by moving immediately after the cast bar appeared in a clockwise or counterclockwise circle and coming to a stop just before reaching the starting point of the circle. The reason for this is that the Twisters would spawn at random wherever you had previously moved during the cast. If you moved too far away from where you were positioned during the Twister cast, the Twister would appear directly below you and subsequently kill you. Despite the clear, a nerf was issued the following week based on player feedback. Yoshi P responded in an official forum post on the day of the nerf that they believed the attack was too unforgiving, so the Twister's timing would be adjusted. When Blue Garter was crowned World First Champions, the teams that failed to clear the raid due to Twisters flared up in rage, even going so far as to call them cheaters. However, Yoshi P laid it all to rest in the same post that announced the Twister nerfs by officially confirming Blue Garter's world first.
Nice.
Now, the reason so many struggled with Twisters wasn't necessarily the mechanics' fault alone, but also the servers. A Realm Reborn's launch servers were really not up to the task, and players experienced high levels of latency. It was especially bad for players in Europe, as Square Enix had decided to place their data center
out of the
in
server-side timing.
Canada,
Fuck
to
that
be
with
exact.
lag.
Fights such as Twintania with her Twisters and Titan with his landslides became unbearable, and Square Enix was forced to consider upgrading and moving their servers.
No, man. That's
Crystal
bullshit.
Tower, a 24-man raid inspired by Final Fantasy III, was teased as far back as late 1.0 and was nowhere to be found in 2.0. The dev team simply didn't have time to complete the content before release. However, Yoshi P and the rest of the dev team promised to deliver a big content patch by the end of the year. And on December 14th, 2013, they delivered A Realm Reborn's very first patch, A Realm Awoken,
baby!
This behemoth of a patch contained an incredible amount of content, including Hildibrand, Crystal Tower's first tier Labyrinth of the Ancients, Ultimate Weapon Hard, Beast Tribes, the first ever hard mode dungeons, Copperbell Mines and Hawk Manor, and the return of the
apologies. Speakers Network mispronounced that just now. It's actually Bukake Manor, hard.
favorite from 1.0, Good King Moggle.
Easy mistake.
But the patch
Easy
didn't
mistake.
only offer content, it offered features and changes to the game as well. A Realm Reborn introduced the item level system, but made it nearly impossible to really tell what your average item level actually was. There was no average item level displayed anywhere in the character screen. You would either have to do the math yourself, or simply use one of the many community-made item level calculators to find your average item level. Prior to the patch, the game had no restrictions built into the duty finder to restrict players with inadequate item level from entering certain content either. 2.1 not only introduced item level restrictions on high level content, but also finally made it possible to see your own item level from the character screen. Measures were also taken to alleviate server strains, mostly aimed at duties within the duty finder. At launch, there was no system to prevent players from leaving their computer and keeping their characters logged into a duty, so they started to clog up the instance servers. To combat this, Square Enix implemented a system whereas a player character was automatically kicked if they remained inactive for 10 minutes. The duty finder, which would pair you up with a party and place you in a dungeon, also suffered abuse by players who would abandon duties if they didn't go as smoothly as they expected, or they simply didn't want to complete a duty, leaving other players clueless and without any way of completing the dungeon. To deter players from leaving duties in progress, the duty finder imposed a 15-minute lockout on release. However, this seemed to not really bother people that much, so in 2.1 the lockout was increased to a whopping 30 minutes. The Party Finder was also introduced in 2.1, which made it possible for players to form parties prior to entering with the Duty Finder. The Party Finder was server-wide and would see a lot of use by players trying to beat raids and extreme content. The patch also introduced PvP to the game, and it got a mixed reception. Final Fantasy XIV's new battle system, albeit streamlined, felt slow and sluggish in PvP, and the whole system felt uninspired and prone to cheesing. The system was riddled with issues at launch and was quickly shunned by the Final Fantasy XIV community. Queue times would quickly rise to more than 30 minutes mere weeks after release. The PvP system would see countless updates over the years. The much anticipated housing system was also launched with this patch, so free companies all over Eorzea swarmed to Mist, the Lavender Beds, and the Goblet in search of their company's new home. But players were in for a rude awakening. Prices were steep, and no servers felt it more than the old 1.0 legacy servers. Square Enix had found the ultimate gill sink. A small 5th class plot, which was the cheapest one on Aegis, Durandal, Gungnir, Riddle, or Masamune, would cost you a whopping 40 million gil. A large one would cost you 500 million gil.
Oh my god.
If you were a new player in a new free company on a legacy server, your chances of being able...
The prices aren't like that now though, right? It's not as bad as that difference. Like a small plot is 40 mil, a large plot is 500. It's not like that now, is it?
Able to afford a house at the time, regardless of size, was slim. The sheer size of this patch was impressive. The patch was almost worthy of being called an expansion and brought massive changes and additions to Eorzea.
Yeah, it was huge.
A Realm Reborn has survived the rebirth, weathered through its first raid,
it has very serious in it, so good.
Implemented its first content patch with A Realm Awoken. For a game developer, you couldn't ask for a better outcome. But A Realm Reborn still has a lot of issues to resolve, and danger looms on the horizon.
Uh-oh, PlayStation 3. Damn. All right, so the house prices are like 10% different.
Another time.
Okay.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV. Please leave a like if you enjoyed and subscribe if you want more stuff like this. We have a Final Fantasy...
The way that I've been playing through my journey of an Eorzean Lifetime is that I have been going through chronological order of patch release and stuff. And I also, through 5.1 through to where I am right now, I check out the websites, the official patch websites, read through everything, watch the trailer. And like, I remember after rolling credits on 2.0 and then going through the patch 2.1 website, which there is a video of my reactions for all of those on my channel. I was like, can you imagine being a player at this time and this drops? Like, you are beyond happy. There is so much content. It is like another game. There is enough stuff there that you'd be like, holy shit, this is huge. Well worth the wait. You got player housing. Like, that's an expansion worthy thing to begin with. Like, I'd expect another company to charge you X number of dollars, like 40 or 50 box price, to be like, okay, if you want to try the new feature out, you have to buy the thing. But it was just rolled in. Like, utterly mind-blowing how hard they went in 2.1.
14 podcast, 2 Final Fantasy XIV retrospective series, Remnants and Secrets of a Realm, as well as a minimum item level run series. Anyways, I'll be back in the next episode of the Fall and Rise of Final Fantasy XIV. Until then, may you ever walk in the light of the crystal.